The year was 1945. The sky over Europe was silent for the first time in 6 years, and the P-51 Mustang, the Cadillac of the skies, reigned supreme. It was the plane that had broken the back of the Luftwaffe, escorted bombers to Berlin, and turned the tide of the air war. But as the champagne corks popped on VE Day, the Mustang's greatest enemy wasn't a Messerschmitt or a flat gun, it was irrelevance. Almost overnight, the most feared piston-engine fighter in history became a logistical nightmare for a world desperate for peace. The United States military suddenly found itself with an inventory of over 15,000 Mustangs and nowhere to put them. The dawn of the jet age had arrived, and the whistling roar of the early P-80 shooting stars made the growl of the Mustang's Merlin engine sound like a relic of the past. To the Pentagon, these weren't legends, they were excess inventory taking up valuable hangar space. The hero of the war was about to be treated like common trash. Across the United States and the Pacific, massive aircraft graveyards began to swell. At fields like Kingman, Arizona, hundreds of Mustangs were lined up wingtip to wingtip, baking in the desert sun. Many were sold to the public for as little as $3,500, roughly the price of a high-end family car at the time. Civilians bought them just to harvest the high-octane fuel and high-quality aluminum, often scrapping the airframes on the spot. But the fate of the Mustangs overseas was even darker. To avoid the massive cost of shipping thousands of used fighters back to America, the military made a cold financial decision. In the Pacific and parts of Europe, pristine, combat-ready Mustangs were stripped of their clocks and compasses, towed to the edges of aircraft carriers or coastal cliffs, and simply pushed into the ocean. Billions of dollars in engineering and the very machines that won the war were sent to the bottom of the sea, buried in the silt and forgotten. It seemed the Mustang's story was over, a glorious chapter closed by a scrapyard crane. But as the Cold War began to simmer, the world would realize that the old Warbird still had one more bloody secret to share. By 1950, the P-51 Mustang, now redesignated as the F-51, was supposed to be a museum piece. The U.S. Air Force had gone all in on the jet age, betting the future of warfare on the sleek, fuel-thirsty F-80 shooting stars. But when the Korean War broke out, the high-tech dream hit a low-tech wall. The jet engines of the era were delicate and required long, paved, pristine runways, something the rugged, bomb-scarred mountains of Korea simply didn't have. This was the speed glitch of the 1950s. The Air Force realized their billion-dollar jets were useless if they couldn't take off from the mud and gravel of the front lines. Desperate, the Pentagon reached back into the scrapyards. Hundreds of F-51 Mustangs were pulled out of storage, hosed down, and shipped across the Pacific. The old man was being sent back to the front for one last brutal job. But Korea wasn't like the high-altitude dogfights over Germany. The Mustang was now being used as a mud mover. Because it could take off from dirt strips and loiter over a target for hours, it became the ultimate close air support weapon. Pilots were ordered to fly on the deck, screaming just feet above the rice paddies to hunt down North Korean T-34 tanks and supply trucks. It was a dirty, terrifying way to fly. Without the high-altitude protection of a squadron, the Mustang was vulnerable to every farmer with a machine gun and every hidden anti-aircraft battery in the hills. The Merlin engine, the very thing that made the Mustang a legend, became its greatest weakness. One single bullet to the cooling system would cause the engine to seize in minutes, leaving the pilot with a choice: bail out over enemy territory or try to belly land on a rocky hillside. The Mustang was no longer a graceful interceptor. It was a blue-collar brawler doing the work the jets couldn't handle.
It was a suicide mission that saved the Pusan perimeter, proving that in the chaos of real war, a $3,500 propeller plane was worth more than a dozen grounded jets. The Mustang was bloodied, battered, and outdated, but it refused to die.
By the late 1950s, the Mustang was finally, officially done with war. The Air Force moved on to supersonic interceptors, and the last of the F-51s were pushed out of the hangars and onto the auction block. But this wasn't the end, it was a rebirth. What followed was one of the strangest transformations in history. A mass-produced weapon of death became the ultimate high-speed status symbol for the world's most daring aviators. The scrap value era ended as a new breed of pilot emerged, the air racer. Civilians began buying surplus Mustangs, stripping out the heavy armor plating, the machine guns, and the radio gear to make them as light as possible. They clipped the wings, modified the Merlin engines to run on specialized high-octane racing fuel, and painted them in loud, shimmering chrome and neon colors. These planes weren't flying to Berlin anymore. They were screaming around pylons at the Reno air races at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. The Mustang had transitioned from a soldier to a gladiator. As the decades passed, a Mustang economy began to form. Because so many were destroyed in the graveyards of 1946 or lost in the mud of Korea, the surviving airframes became incredibly rare. What was once sold for $3,500 in 1946 is now a $4 million to $5 million investment. Today, owning a P-51 is the ultimate flex for billionaires and tech moguls. It is the Ferrari of the sky, requiring a specialized mechanic, a climate-controlled hangar, and a pilot with nerves of steel. But there is a deeper magic to the P-51's survival. Unlike modern stealth jets that are essentially flying computers, the Mustang is pure aviation, pistons, oil, and the smell of high-octane fuel. When you see a polished P-51 fly over a stadium today, you aren't just looking at a plane, you're looking at a survivor. It outlived the scrapyards, it outlived the suicide missions of Korea, and it outlived the very military that tried to throw it away. The P-51 Mustang proved that while technology moves on, legends only get faster with age. It remains the immortal king of the piston era, a ghost of the past that still owns the sky.